The BBC faces its biggest scandal over its deceit that may have led to the death of Princess Diana. The latest Israel-Palestinian conflict may be at an end, and few are really talking about why that happened, and the German Greens are in with a shot of the government elections coming up if they can win support for their shock radical proposal. My name's Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. The BBC has attracted a fair bit of criticism in recent years. This week it hit rock bottom. The report came in on how its reporter fed lies to Princess Diana in advance of a scoop interview 25 years ago, and how the corporation has covered up for it ever since. Yesterday, the heir to the throne and Diana's son, William, the Duke of Cambridge, put the case that his mother might still be alive today if the BBC hadn't acted as it did, and it's entirely credible. The journalist in question, Martin Bashir, a man coming to terms right now with being almost certainly the most hated man in the country, he told Diana lies designed to make her trust him and to be more likely to dish the dirt on the royal family. He told her that her car was being constantly tracked, her phones were being tapped, senior figures in the royal court were determined to do her down. He told her that even her bodyguards were plotting against her. Now think about that. You're feeling hunted and vulnerable, and then somebody credibly claiming to have the inside track because he was the BBC after all, and he'd shown them forged documents to show that he knew what he was talking about. He told you that the people assigned to protect you were actually in on the scheme. Diana's brother, who recorded all the claims in his notes of a meeting, decided that Bashir was a liar and a fantasist and declined to have any more to do with him, but she was taken in. And according to Prince William, all of this fed her later paranoia, and why wouldn't it? And that led her to be without British security. It led her to be attracted to the son of the eccentric Harrods boss, Mohammed Al-Fayed, who had impressive levels of security on hand, which must have been very reassuring, except that regardless of the armoured cars and the hired hands, the human element was weak. So she ended up being driven away at speed from the paparazzi by a man who was inebriated. The consequences of which we know. That's not something that would ever have been allowed to happen if she'd still been under the British security protection. So that's all very despicable. It's no surprise that the police have said they're looking at the report to see if anything goes into the realm of criminal behaviour. But that will focus on Bashir himself. The point is that the BBC continue to deny that there'd been a problem. When he was finally pushed to carry out an inquiry, his process was what this week's report described as woeful in its failings. So that was back then. We don't know about its failings since then, because that was excluded from the inquiry's terms of reference. The point is that the BBC wants you to know that it's changed, because it's been covering the story as extensively as anyone has. Indeed, there are times when there's a big anti-BBC story that the corporation almost delights in reporting the brutality of it all. The Radio 4 Today programme presenters are particularly skilled in corporate self-flagellation. It's an exercise in saying, look at how extraordinary and trustworthy we are. We're holding ourselves to account just as much as we do for others. But of course, they do it on topics where they can portray it's a past aberration, one rogue reporter, one unfortunate mistake. They'll sometimes take the bosses to task. The point is that the journalistic bad practice and the cover-ups now have a building history that implies that this is cultural and that it's alive and well. Lord Grade, a former BBC Director General, said this week that the corporation's default position is "we're never wrong." But this is the corporation that willfully ignored and then covered up the Jimmy Savile abuse scandal, rewarding those who kept quiet, punishing those who spoke out internally. The ex-BBC producer Marion Jones reflected after the event, everyone involved on the right side of the Savile argument has been forced out of the BBC. It's the corporation that failed to cover the Telford sex abuse scandal, with the mass rape of young girls simply considered not to be a story. apparently due to the ethnic makeup of the perpetrators, and then again for several similar instances in other parts of the country for the same reason. It's the corporation that destroyed Cliff Richard's life by conspiring with police to get aerial footage of the singer's home being raided on charges that turned out to be completely without merit. And it remained unrepentant, even refusing his request that they withdraw the item from its submission for an award. Then there are big questions about the reporting of supposed Syrian chemical attacks, reporting the last UK European elections and managing not to mention the name of the winning Brexit party in their summary of the results, and consistently failing to provide balance in its coverage of the original Brexit debate, which was kind of a big deal, and so on and so on. Now, the reach and the spread of the BBC is one where you'd expect some mistakes, but the increasing message is that the BBC's overall culture is blind to its own failings, is hopelessly compromised on the key issues of the day. It's something I've talked about on this channel, particularly noticing the campaigning done by the BBC figures to argue that climate change is definitely not to be solved by technology but only by lifestyle change. Very quickly you always get to the messages you need to fly less and stop eating meat. Indeed, just in the last week, one of the headlines from the Sunday Politics interview Andrew Marr show, where he interviewed Biden's climate czar John Kerry. Kerry had just been talking about moving to alternative energy, next generation nuclear capacity, which is an interesting thing for him to drop in, and the aggressive programme to get the entire power sector carbon free by 2035. So many things a serious-minded journalist would want to interrogate with that list of promises. Instead, Marr jumps in with, isn't the simple, slightly brutal truth that you're going to have to tell Americans eventually to eat less meat. The fact Kerry disagrees and points instead to work being done to reduce the emissions from meat production, that was then the generator of the headlines the BBC chose to amplify elsewhere by their campaigning journalist Roger Harabin. John Kerry, US climate envoy, criticised for optimism on clean tech. And it was the same technique that I've called Harabin out for using before. He gets some of his friends to give outrage quotes and then he uses them as the story. Kerry was ridiculed, he said, for suggesting that you don't have to give up quality of life to achieve some of the things we want to achieve. Kerry had told Marr, I think there's a false choice here that you're presenting people, but it is the only choice that the BBC currently presents. Now, that's not going to get hauled up for an inquiry. It's not going to even get complaints. It's just the normal way that business is done at the BBC. Campaigning masquerading as journalism. It may be one reason why Andrew Neil's forthcoming GB News has a head of steam behind it, because there are now so many who are noticing the BBC has lost its way and want an alternative. Challengers are emerging because they sense the opportunity. This is the week that the crisis got a whole lot worse for the BBC and the opportunity perhaps better for them. Now, in a minute, we'll look at the rest of the week's news. But first, in India, daily death counts for COVID-19 continue to be high as hospitals struggle for capacity and oxygen remains in short supply. That has been exacerbated by the rise of cases of black fungus, which is being put down to rampant inappropriate medication with antibiotics. One example of what can go wrong if you self-medicate on bad information. But there's something else going on. One aspect that hasn't been much reported is that 2 Indian states, Goa and Uttarakhand, have now started mass prescribing the use of ivermectin as a prophylactic. That goes against the WHO's current advice, but the states say that they're being advised by expert panels. It goes against the manufacturer Merck's advice, but others point to the rise of some peer-reviewed studies suggesting enough grounds for optimism that, might justify states in the difficult crisis times that India is currently in giving it a try. Ivermectin has been one of those drugs that conspiracists love to promote as a wonder drug and argue that it's being suppressed by the shadowy powers that be. And as a result of those conspiracies, the wide circulation of some wild stories, you even have the drug mentioned specifically by name in YouTube's community guidelines as something that should not be promoted. Is there a chance that all of that means that we fail to notice something more solidly based that we actually should be paying attention to? What is The argument over this drug. Why is it even an argument at all? Is it another example of panicked, ill-advised, wrong medication in a crisis? Or is there more to it? Well, that's what I'm going to be looking at in the video to go live on this channel at 7 PM UK time next week. Join me then. After a couple of weeks of intense fighting that saw real human tragedy on the ground and had all the usual protests going on, Israel and Hamas finally announced a ceasefire yesterday to the recent hostilities. You may be left wondering, what happened? I mean, 1 minute we've had relative peace for a while, some Arab countries signing normalisation treaties with Israel, and then the next, all of this. The partisans on each side have been coming up with explanations that mostly revolve around the other side being uniquely evil. But as always, it comes down to politics. What did Hamas hope to achieve when it first fired salvos of rockets at Jerusalem on Monday last week? Hamas's key audience is with its own people, along with the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and some of the other states, particularly Iran. These groups are never as homogenous as they may seem from the outside. Hamas has been divided in recent years. The political leader of Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, has tried to push a more diplomatic course with Israel, a position that has been pretty hard to sustain. His principal opponent in that has been Mohammad Deif, the commander of the military wing, who favours closer ties with Iran. The rocket barrage means that either Sinwar has either caved in or has been pushed aside on that strategy. Now, of course, the official Hamas justifications for the attacks, that they were in response to Israeli police actions towards protesters, that's not the real reason. 4 weeks ago, the Palestinian president Mahmoud Abbas postponed parliamentary elections that were due to take place on the grounds that, seemed quite likely he might lose them, or at least that Hamas would make significant progress at his expense. Israel, allowing a protest to get out of control, gave the group the excuse it needed to put themselves in the role of being the true leaders of the Palestinian struggle. That, plus they wanted to attract Iran's support after a period when relations had been strained and their sources of other income had dried up in recent years. So a period of conflict suits them. It puts them in the regional power role that they want to be in. It rather suits Israel as well, because it can defend itself well, and by responding effectively and aggressively, it plays to the right constituency at home, looking strong on defence and warding off the hostile world again. Which, at a time when Netanyahu is under serious domestic political pressure, does him no harm whatsoever. They have been determined to deliver some more serious damage to Hamas than the group had counted on, because they want to deter them from simply doing this every time it suits their internal political interests. It's the people on the ground who suffer, of course. And the jaw-dropping thing is the outside commentators criticising Israel on the basis that the casualties in the conflict have been mostly one-sided. If only Israel's Iron Dome defences hadn't been so good and more Israelis had died, then maybe we could be more supportive. It's just one of a number of positions people place on a situation like this uniquely that they would never apply to themselves. However, for the sake of all of the innocents caught up with this, it is at least good news that it has played out to its conclusion, we hope. The only other aspect that's notable from how it ended is that it happened when Netanyahu wanted it to happen. Joe Biden's influence on the situation has been broadly seen to be minimal. Now, whether that's true or not, it's not a welcome message to be going out in the early days of the administration if it's made him look weak. And his administration has been rushing around and talking about all of the things going on behind the scenes and so on, and they may be true, but probably ultimately it's the dynamics between Hamas and Israel that dictated the fact that it started, the length of time it lasted, and when it finished. And whether deservedly or not, he won't have changed the impression of weakness with the recent announcement that Biden has backed down in his opposition to the Russia-Germany gas pipeline Nord Stream 2. This week he put aside proposed sanctions on the subject, largely, it's reported, to avoid damaging relations with Germany. It's also reported that Russian officials were delighted when they were told by the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, of the decision. So, lovely. At least someone's happy. Speaking of Germany, it looks like it's about to deliver an interesting political experiment. As you probably know, elections are due later this year for Angela Merkel's replacement as Chancellor, the Greens, who in Germany have become significantly more mainstream than most of their namesakes in the other European countries, seem to have a realistic chance of taking it. Angela Merkel's anointed successor within the CDU is seen as something of an underperformer when it comes to popular support. And the CDU party has faced some backlash in recent months from the slow vaccine rollout and the renewed lockdown measures. The Greens have put forward Annalena Baerbock, seen by the public as an attractive, charismatic candidate, and the party has been keeping a slim lead over recent months. This week there was a poll showing that 67% of Germans want to change a government, 55% want a boost in the country's climate policy. But this is the moment when you start to get real scrutiny. And it's going to be genuinely fascinating how this goes. The Greens this week said that they intended to do away with short-haul holiday flights by the end of the decade, with a massive expansion of the rail network. It'll also end subsidies for aircraft fuel, which should also raise flight prices more generally. When Baerbock was asked about the current, or at least the recent, pandemic and all, €29 flights to Mallorca, one of the most popular destinations for Germans, she said, "Anyone can go on vacation anywhere they like, but an environmentally just tax on flights would put a stop to this kind of price dumping." In other words, bye-bye cheap holidays. So this is a real test of the proposition that the more extreme environmentalists make. They say, with zero evidence to date, that the population will support or could be brought online to support radical environmental action that would result in changes to their lifestyle. The BBC message. As you know, if you are a regular viewer of this channel, I have my doubts on that score for a number of reasons. But now it seems it's going to get tested. Can the Greens get elected? They're seen as mature enough to be a leading part of a government. Remember, any government in Germany will almost certainly be a coalition government because of the electoral system there. They have a popular leader, and the country wants change. With all those advantages, they're saying to the German people, vote for us. And we will no doubt do all sorts of other things that we're promising, but one of them will be to end your cheap holidays. Traditional logic says that this is against the laws of political gravity. But the ecologists say that climate change has meant that the rules have all changed. Well, we'll see about that. As you would expect, the other parties have lined up to attack the measure they will be aiming to take full advantage. Alright, now in a minute we'll get to replying to comments and the final thought for the week. But first, next week I will be doing another standard Q&A video. So not a live stream, but questions in advance. Patreon supporters' questions will get precedence because there has to be a way of thanking them for their support. I may choose 2 or 3 of the most interesting questions from wherever they come to spend a bit longer on, depending on who asks the most interesting questions. So there's your challenge. Either way, if there's something you'd like to talk about, put your question down below, preceded by the word question in all caps so that I can't miss it. Patreon supporters, put yours as responses to my recent post on the Patreon website. It'll be fast. It'll be furious. Well, slightly tetchy anyway. Join me for a vigorous canter through all the issues that you most care about, going live on this channel on Wednesday next week, 7 PM UK time. See you then. One question I had on the recent discussion on voting. What do you think about making voting compulsory, like in Australia? According to a paper on compulsory voting impacts from 2014, there's something like 30 countries that have compulsory voting. You mentioned Australia. It's worth noting that Australia ended up with that because the Labour Party felt its own supporters tended to be less well motivated to get out to the polls than the other sides. So this was their way of equalising these things out. Motivating your own voters to get to the polls has always been a traditional part of political campaigning. One reason why good organisation on the ground can make a difference to the election. The argument for compulsion is that you get a more representative reflection of the views of the population. more democratic legitimacy. The argument against is that you are forcing those who tend to be less politically informed and interested to vote. So they're more likely to cast that vote with little consideration, providing arguably less democratic legitimacy. For myself, voting is an important privilege of living in a democratic society, something to be prized. I always make sure that I vote, even when uninspired by the choices available. Which, astonishing I know, but it has happened. You do better, I think, by promoting that view, celebrating the right to vote, seeing it as something of high value, than you do by turning it into a chore imposed on you by the state. You see, the countries that have had compulsory voting, who then removed it, massively had reduced turnout. And I think that's reflective of how the compulsion had led it to be viewed by the population. All right, one more question. Now that the vaccines have shown that years/decades of clinical trials are not needed and months will suffice to establish a drug is safe, what is the impact on the development of future vaccines? Given enough money and political will, can all diseases be eradicated in a few years, or at least medicine be pumped out at a much faster rate? It might be worth doing a video looking at this in detail because, as I understand it, the technology that goes into the mRNA vaccines does open up new possibilities. In simplistic terms, and I make no claims of a strict accuracy in my framing here, the exciting element of the mRNA approach is that you somewhat remove the delivery mechanism that has to be shown to be safe in rigorous trials from the payload, how it targets specific diseases. Hence why, with the appearance of new variants of COVID, they feel they can quickly revamp the vaccines to fit without having to go through a whole separate trial process. And yes, then there's no reason why that doesn't get to focus on a number of other diseases as well. Malaria is certainly in some people's sights, I was reading a few months ago. Let's not believe in miracle drugs though, or get carried away. You could see a world where we make some significant progress against diseases where we've struggled in the past. And we could see a rapid response infrastructure being created to cut the response time to new pandemics by a significant amount. I would expect there are other implications hidden there as well, and no doubt some concerns, hence why it might be an interesting video to make. Well, tell me what you think about that in the comments below. I talk a lot on this channel about the interface between scientific knowledge and public policy, and it's been a big topic in the last couple of years for obvious reasons. And we've seen the dialogue about the technocrats, the expert panels advising on COVID pandemics or on climate change, and the globalists who think the answer to these genuinely global problems is more experts. And we've seen the dialogue about politicians, particularly the populist ones, going to the other extreme, ignoring the evidence in favour of what they prefer to believe, and then reaping the whirlwind. And in case you thought that latter one was strictly a recent phenomenon, by the way, I was just reading this week about Dr. Royal Copeland, the New York City Health Commissioner, who in 1918 insisted that there was not the slightest danger of an epidemic of Spanish influenza in New York. When the first cases then subsequently arrived, he brushed them off, saying, "You haven't heard of our doughboys getting it, have you? You bet you haven't, and you won't." He continued refusing to take any measures as the case numbers mounted until eventually a former health commissioner stepped up and sounded the alarm. It's a reminder that whenever we face a new phenomenon, we can usually look to history and see how human beings tend to behave, all the mistakes that we're inclined to make. And this thought is what I took out of it. Part 1. The technical incompetence of politicians when faced with a situation requiring specialist expertise, that is the best argument for technocracy. But then part 2, conversely, the political incompetence of technocrats is the best argument against it. And we see that in spades as well. The admission last week that the psychology experts have gotten way too carried away in devising ways to make the public afraid of the COVID pandemic and therefore compliance on government rules. And with Dr. Fauci and the CDC admitting they told people what they thought they needed to hear, not necessarily what was actually true. The expertise has been important. We needed it. But the politicians didn't know how to ask the right questions. The technocrats got tempted into devising the questions as well as the answers as a result. So if the technical incompetence of politicians is the argument for technocracy and the political incompetence of technocrats is the argument against it, where does that leave us? All we really require of our political leaders is competence. In the UK, the government got a vaccine boost. Why? Because it was an important programme and it was delivered with extraordinary competence. Forget the ideology, forget the left versus right. Really, the majority of people would be happy to be left alone when things don't need fixing, and then competent administration when they do. There is no training, not in the UK, not in the US or anywhere else that I'm aware of, for politicians to become competent in the actual administration of government. No way to train for it, no way to measure success. Is it any wonder that we fail more often in that space than we should? All right. Have a look at this.
Something changed. YouTube decided to no longer work with us and be on our side. We've been having a lot of problems over the last few months. We've been unfairly demonetized, shadow banned, and our videos no longer being recommended to many non-subscribers. You've seen the problems recently. Big tech censorship has been hitting a lot of channels, especially the so-called right-wing news channels, and this channel has not been exempt from it.
One YouTube commenter who is now leaving the platform because the channel has either shadow banned him or put him into a category to get zero promotion. I had to notice that because from his description and the timing from when he said it had happened, it seemed to match exactly what has happened to this channel. Here's what I see. The previous period where a number of evergreen videos were performing strongly, some new videos would take off more than others for sure, new subscribers at the rate of 100 per day, and then suddenly done, bumping along from the bottom. Mostly views from existing subscribers, almost zero new subscriptions, 100 over 2 months. Just before it happened, I published the video review on When Harry Met Sally, the book on transgender issues that was banned by Amazon. I published the video on the Wuhan lab leak hypothesis. Now, I'm not about to jump to conclusions about what happened. It may have nothing to do with those videos or other content choices, may have more to do with tweaks of the algorithm. Either way, as you can tell from my choice of Monday's video, I am not going to avoid the topics of interest here. And I'm free to do that particularly because of the support that I get from people on Patreon. It enables me to put in the time that I do to produce 3 videos per week, even though advertising revenue is on the floor. And it enables me to focus on whatever topics I think you will find interesting and which are the most important topics. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please go to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. It is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show.